This is Draco. Salve! Have you ever paused to think about just how much Draco's brain needs to process in order to learn Latin or in order to make sense of a Latin text? How often do you think about all the things your students' brains need to process in order to be successful in your class? I'm not sure how much we as Latin teachers keep that in mind when we're planning and executing lessons, especially the strain on learners' working memories, which can have a huge effect on whether the learning that we're trying to facilitate actually happens. In this video, I want to help us with that. Salve! Justin here from the Latin Teacher Lab. So really quickly, what is working memory anyway, and what role does it play in your students learning Latin or anything else in your class? It's a bit of a misnomer because it's not necessarily about remembering things. Working memory is simply the capacity of a brain to process multiple pieces of information at the same time. That's crucial in the process of learning because pretty much all learning involves that in some way. In particular, language learning, in this case Latin learning, involves at a bare minimum keeping in mind the meaning of a word or sequence of words and the form that that word or sequence of words takes. So for Draco here to process and acquire, let's say, curro, Draco's brain needs to simultaneously hold in balance the idea of someone running, that it's another person, that it's one person, and the sounds or the spellings involved in curro. And that's the bare minimum, right? That's not even taking into account other things in the sentence or in the setting or what Draco is supposed to be doing with that information. Now here's the problem, and it's a big one, but that means that solving it can bring big benefits. The human working memory, and Draco's too, is really limited. It can only hold so many things before some start getting dropped or the brain gets overloaded and shuts down the learning process. If you're wondering how many things, you'll often see a range between 5 and 9 cited, but that's pretty abstract and not all things are created equal. So what can we do as teachers to avoid overloading Draco's and any other learner's brain, which could make our hard work of planning and teaching turn out to be in vain? In a way, it's simple. We can just make sure there isn't too much going on in our class. We can make sure there aren't too many moving parts in an activity. We can make sure we aren't trying to teach too much too fast. But I want to give you some more specific solutions too, as well as a twist on this whole concept. The solutions all involve in some way reducing the demands placed on students' working memory. Another way of saying that is to minimize cognitive load. Cognitive load being whatever the current contents of a working memory are. Number one is to have less going on in the environment or in the materials we use, and thus in students' brains, specifically in order to counter what's called the split attention effect. The split attention effect comes from having multiple sources of information at the same time, especially multiple sources of the same kind of information, such as visual information. To give a really practical example for our Latin classes and materials, a lot of times a page of text will have the text, but also some diagrams, some grammatical notes, some glosses at the bottom, and other types of visual information. If a student actually needs all those things to make sense of the text, that's a severe burden on working memory. That can be partially solved, by the way, by things as simple as moving glosses from the bottom of the page, where they involve the biggest eye jump, to the margin right next to the word or set of words in question, or even better, in text right next to the word in question, which makes them almost like the same piece of visual information. Another really important thing to keep in mind when we're trying to reduce the moving parts for Draco or for other students is that in any given learning task or situation, it's not just the Latin or whatever content or skill is to be learned that fills Draco's working memory. If the task or activity is something students are new to, and especially if it involves a lot of steps or moving between different sources of information, then that too could place a significant strain on working memory. By the way, a nice bonus for you as a teacher of reducing moving parts, not bothering with a lot of bells and whistles, is that it can save you a lot of time in your planning and prep. And I'm all about that. Solution number two is taking advantage of what's called the modality effect. I mentioned in number one that multiple simultaneous sources of information can lead to overload. Well, that's especially the case if it's the same modality, such as visual information. Much less so if some of the information is visual and some is auditory. Now pause, I want to be really clear because I've used the words visual and auditory now. This has nothing to do with supposed learning styles or anything like that. It's just about the effect of different types of information on working memory. A common example for taking advantage of the modality effect is not putting as much visual information on a page or screen, and instead complementing that information with oral information, such as an oral explanation. So think about how you present text and other information to students and how you can divide some of that information between visual and auditory information. Again, not for the sake of learning styles, but in order to balance out the burden on students' working memories. Last but not least, number 3 is reduce the problem space. The problem space is simply the distance between what a learner can currently do and what they're trying to learn to do. Now, we all know that it'd be silly to introduce a gap that's too big here, but you might realize that that gap actually is there, maybe wider than you think, if you start looking at it through the lens of the burden placed on learners' working memories. This is a great place to remind us that the absolute ease or difficulty of a certain learning target is completely irrelevant in the learning process. All that matters is where real students who are sitting in our current classes actually are. All that matters is where Draco is right now at this moment in history and the distance between that and the thing Draco's trying to learn. If that problem space is too big, then trying to overcome it is going to involve putting way too many things on Draco's working memory to try to force the situation. So when you're designing lessons and living them out in your classes, pay attention to the actual problem space. Not the gap you wish were between your students and the thing you'd love for them to learn, but the actual gap between the real students in your class and that thing. Remember I said there'd be a twist? Well, here it is. Human working memory is pretty limited in the first place, but it's limited even more by stress. The actual capacity, those 5 to 9 things, is reduced by stress. The greater the stress, the more it's reduced. So it might be the case on a given day that for Draco, who might have 7 or 8 working memory slots available under ideal circumstances, the stress in his life in general, and then maybe the stress from our class, actually reduces those slots down to 1 or 2 or 3 or 0. So when that happens, and as a result, Draco struggles to learn the thing or even to participate, that's not Draco not trying hard enough. It's not Draco not caring enough. It's literally impossible for Draco to do that learning given the strain on his limited working memory. And by the way, even if Draco's stress leaves him a slot or 2 of working memory capacity, those slots might actually be filled by the things that he's stressed about. So what can we do? Well, it turns out that because of this problem and its pervasiveness, one of the best and the least demanding on you solutions to the working memory problem is simply to make your class a basically calm and pleasant place. You can do that explicitly at the beginning of your class or wherever it feels necessary through things like calming exercises. You can do that without even departing from Latin if you use things like the acroamata tranquilla from the Latin Teacher Lab. But you can also make things calmer and more pleasant with everything from your demeanor to how you structure a class, the balance between high and low energy tasks, how you approach assessment, and much more. This is the kind of thing we're always working on solutions and materials for in the Latin Teacher Lab, so check us out using the link in the description. And there's lots more on this channel about teaching Latin in ways that are good for our students and our brains. If you're not sure where to start with that, check out this video next. As always, I wish you and your students joy and success. Wale!